Get ready for a clash of titans. Two world champions, Boris Spassky and Mihail Tal, face off in the complex and strategic Nimzo-Indian defense. This is going to be a classic. Spassky opens with standard central pawn moves. Tal responds with the Nimzo-Indian, pinning the knight with his bishop on b4. Spassky challenges the bishop, and Tal immediately breaks the pin with a pawn push to h6. White maintains the pressure by dropping the bishop back to h4. Tal challenges the center with c5, and Spassky clamps down, pushing his pawn to d5 and creating a very tense central structure. And here, Tal immediately complicates things with a creative but inaccurate pawn sacrifice. A more solid approach was available. The stronger try was pawn to d6, white plays pawn to e3, bishop takes the knight on c3 with check, the pawn recaptures, and pawn to e5, keeping a very stable position. But in the game, Tal lashes out with the flank pawn to b5, inviting chaos at the cost of giving white a slight edge. Spassky accepts the challenge, trading pawns on e6 before capturing the offered pawn on b5. Tal strikes back in the center with d5, and after white plays e3, black calmly castles kingside. Spassky continues with the natural developing move, bringing his knight to f3, and here comes the magic. Tal uncorks the brilliant queen to a5, a stunning pawn sacrifice that puts immense pressure on white's queenside. And here's the point. If white plays queen to c2, black develops with bishop to d7, white plays bishop to e2, and now the bishop simply snaps up the pawn on b5, winning it back with interest. Spassky resolves the pin by trading his bishop for the knight, and Tal recaptures with the rook. After some maneuvering, black's knight joins the fight, and Tal blasts open the center with the pawn push to d4. But Spassky finds a brilliant reply. Pawn takes d4 is a clever counter-sacrifice to deflect black's attack. Here's the idea. If black grabs the pawn on a6, white simply castles kingside. After knight takes d4, the bishop takes the bishop on a6, and white is winning material. Wow. Instead of a simple recapture, Tal goes for the spectacular, sacrificing the exchange with rook takes the knight on f3. It's an inaccuracy. Pawn takes d4 was stronger, but this is pure Tal. Spassky has no choice but to accept the gift, and the bishop takes the rook on f3. And now, pawn takes d4 is a great move. This is the only way for Tal to maintain the initiative and justify his sacrifice. Another brilliant move, this time from Spassky. He castles kingside, a sound sacrifice to get his king to safety and fight for the initiative. What a game. Tal immediately cashes in as the pawn takes the knight on c3 and white's pawn recaptures. And bishop takes the pawn on c3 is a fantastic follow-up. The only move to keep the pressure on, turning this bishop into a monster attacker. Spassky brings his queen out to d6, trying to create some counterplay. Unbelievable. Another sacrifice. Rook takes the pawn on a6 is a brilliant move from Tal, giving up more material to eliminate a key defender. White's bishop captures the knight on c6, but black's bishop immediately jumps to b4 to join the attack, forcing white's queen to retreat to b8. And rook takes the bishop on c6 is a great move, the correct recapture to keep the attack raging with overwhelming pressure. White tries to consolidate with rooks on the c-file, but Tal is a whirlwind. His bishop lands on c5, and the queen swings from a4 over to f4, zeroing in on the exposed white king. Under immense pressure, Spassky makes an inaccurate move, letting the attack intensify. A better defense was required. The stronger try was rook to d1, black's queen goes to f5, the king steps to h1, rook to b6, and queen to c3, holding things together. But in the game, Spassky played queen to g3, and this allows Tal's queen to invade with decisive effect. Tal's pieces flow into the attack. The queen probes, the bishop comes to b7, and the rook lifts to c7, methodically improving the position while white's queen shuffles back and forth. And here it is, the decisive error. Spassky creates a fatal weakness around his king, and Tal will not miss this. A much tougher defense was available. He could have tried queen to h3, bishop to d5, king to h1, queen to f6, and queen to g4. Instead of that, Spassky played the pawn to g3, and this is simply losing to a crushing sacrifice. There it is. Brilliant. Bishop takes the pawn on f2 with check, a stunning sacrifice that demolishes white's defenses. The point is devastating. If the king moves to f1, the rook swings to f7, the other rook checks on c8, and the bishop takes it, winning a full rook. Spassky chooses to capture, but this walks into a forced sequence. His only real chance to resist was to decline the sacrifice. The best move was king to f1, rook to f7, a check on c8, the bishop takes the rook, and the rook recaptures with check. But in the game, the king takes the bishop on f2, and now black's attack is unstoppable. Tal plays queen to f6 with check. It's a slight inaccuracy. Queen to f5 was even faster, but the position is so dominant it's still completely winning. The white king is forced to run for its life, stepping back to e1, and now queen to e5 is a great move, finding the clearest path to victory. The threat is simple. After rook blocks on e2, rook takes the rook on c1 with check, the king moves to d2, and queen to g5 is a check that wins the rook. Spassky plays king to f1, another inaccuracy under fire that just speeds up the end. But wait, a surprising mistake from Tal, who lets a huge chunk of his advantage slip away. He had a much more direct win. The right move was queen to f5 check, king to g1, queen to e4, the queen takes the bishop and then checks on e3, a much cleaner kill. Instead of that, Tal plays bishop to a6 with check, and for a moment white has a chance to breathe. But Spassky immediately returns the favor with a mistake. King to g1 fails to punish black's error and allows the attack to get right back on track, and Tal is not going to miss a second chance. Queen to d4 check is a great move, re-establishing the decisive attack. The white king is forced to g2, only to be met by another check as the black queen slides to e4. The king returns to g1, another inaccuracy that just makes the defense even harder. Tal brings his bishop to b7. It's a slight slip, but in a position this dominant, almost anything wins, and that's the last straw. This pawn push is the final mistake, walking right into a forced win. The only chance was to try and trade queens. For example, queen takes the pawn on e6 with check, the queens are exchanged, rook takes the rook on c7, queen checks on e3, and king to f1 fighting on. But after the move in the game, the pawn push to h4 allows a beautiful forcing sequence to end it all, and Tal finds it. Queen to h1 is check, a great move that begins the final decisive combination. The king is forced to f2, but the position is completely hopeless. Rook to f7 check. It's a small inaccuracy. Queen to g2 was even faster, but it doesn't matter. This is still crushingly won. Spassky finds a great move, king to e2. The only way to avoid immediate mate and prolong the game, and Tal delivers. Queen to e4 is check, a fantastic final move that forces the win of decisive material, and that is enough for Spassky. And in this position, Boris Spassky resigned. Black wins a wild, brilliant, and chaotic attacking masterpiece. Here's the winning line that Spassky saw. White's queen must block on e3. The bishop checks on a6. The rook is forced to block on c4. The bishop simply takes the rook with check. And after the recapture, black is up a full rook and the game is over.